Welcome to Globewise Entertainment, your home for uncovering the wildest, most shocking, and most forbidden stories in film history. Today, we're diving deep into a time when cinema was breaking all the rules, the 1960s, an era that gave birth to brutal exploitation films so graphic, so outrageous, that many of them were banned around the world. These movies shocked censors, outraged critics, and terrified the establishment, yet they changed film forever. From sleazy grindhouse horrors to boundary-pushing underground hits, we're counting down 12 of the most brutal exploitation movies of the 1960s that dared to go too far. If you love exploring the dark, daring, and controversial side of cinema, then you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe to Globewise Entertainment and turn on the bell icon so you never miss our next deep dive into hidden Hollywood history. And after watching, tell us in the comments, which of these shocking banned films caught your attention the most? Because this is where film history gets raw, real, and completely unfiltered. 1. Love Camp 7, 1969. The film too shocking for its time. In 1969, just as the world was breaking free from the golden age of cinema, one film dared to cross every boundary of taste, morality, and censorship. That film was Love Camp 7. Set during World War II, the story follows two American women sent undercover into a Nazi prison camp, but what awaited them inside was far darker than espionage. It wasn't just a war film, it was a disturbing mix of violence, fear, and psychological horror that critics said no audience should ever have to endure. The movie was created on a shoestring budget by director Lee Frost, known for pushing limits in exploitation cinema. But this time, he went too far, even for the late 1960s. Its raw and graphic themes caused mass outrage across Europe and North America. Censors banned it in the UK, Germany, and several US states. In Britain, the film was added to the infamous Video Nasties list, where it remained prohibited for decades. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, Love Camp 7 became a cult legend. It inspired an entire subgenre known as Exploitation, influencing films like Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, and even modern underground cinema. What makes it truly unforgettable isn't just its shock value, but how it reflects the darker side of 1960s filmmaking, when directors tested how far audiences were willing to go in the name of freedom of expression. Even today, many streaming services refuse to show it, while collectors trade underground copies as if it were cinematic contraband. Love it or hate it, Love Camp 7 remains one of the most brutal and controversial exploitation films of the 1960s, a movie banned not just for what it showed, but for what it dared to say about power and humanity. Would you ever dare to watch a movie banned for decades? Let us know in the comments. And if you're just discovering the wild world of 1960s exploitation cinema, don't forget to subscribe to Globewise Entertainment for more shocking Hollywood history. 2. The Naked Witch, 1964. The Curse That Refused to Die. In 1964, horror and exploitation collided in a way few audiences were ready for. The Naked Witch, directed by Larry Buchanan, promised cheap thrills, but what it delivered was something far more sinister. The story begins when a young college student, researching ancient witchcraft, ventures into a small Texas town obsessed with old legends. Against all warnings, he discovers the grave of a woman once accused of witchcraft centuries ago, and in a moment of reckless curiosity, he removes the stake driven through her heart. What follows is pure, eerie vengeance. The witch awakens, not as a monster from folklore, but as a vengeful spirit determined to punish the descendants of those who condemned her. Shot on a shoestring budget, The Naked Witch mixed seductive imagery with shocking violence, and that combination proved too much for censors. Many local theaters refused to show it, and in several US states and parts of Europe, it was flat-out banned for its immoral content and indecent exposure. Yet despite its crude production and controversial scenes, The Naked Witch became a cult relic, one of the earliest examples of a regional horror exploitation film that dared to use folklore, revenge, and forbidden sensuality to attract audiences. Today, it's remembered less for its scares and more for what it represented, the rebellious spirit of 1960s grindhouse cinema, when filmmakers with no money and no rules could still terrify the establishment. A witch resurrected. A curse reborn. A movie too wild for its own time. 3. Bloodfast, 1963. The film too savage for the 60s. In 1963, a small, low-budget film called Bloodfast shocked audiences so deeply that some theaters refused to even project it. Directed by an unknown filmmaker named Harold M. Greeley, this forgotten exploitation gem pushed every moral and cinematic limit of its time. On the surface, Bloodfast seemed like just another grindhouse thriller, a story about a secret society obsessed with human endurance. But beneath that lurked something much darker, a raw depiction of cruelty, control, and the breaking point of the human spirit. The movie followed a war veteran named Jonas Hale, who returns home only to be lured into a violent underground cult that tests purity through pain. What began as a psychological study quickly devolved into scenes that left censors horrified, slow, intense sequences of struggle and psychological breakdown, all presented in stark, unflinching black and white. What made Bloodfast notorious wasn't just its violence, it was the atmosphere. Greeley used handheld cameras, extreme close-ups, and distorted sound effects to create a sense of panic that made audiences physically uncomfortable. It wasn't entertainment, it was an experience meant to unsettle. Film boards across the US, the UK, and Australia banned Bloodfast for indecent cruelty and moral corruption. Even in underground screenings, projectionists were warned to keep buckets ready for fainting viewers. Today, only fragments of Bloodfast survive, reels recovered from an abandoned theater in New Orleans in the late 1980s. Restoration experts say the film is damaged beyond repair, which only adds to its mythic reputation. Was it truly too shocking for its time, or was it simply misunderstood art? Whether seen as art or obscenity, Bloodfast, 1963, remains one of the most controversial examples of 1960s exploitation cinema, a film so raw that it vanished almost as soon as it was born. Some films make you think. Bloodfast made people remember and never forget. For The Touch of Her Flesh, 1967. In 1967, underground cinema took a dark and disturbing turn with The Touch of Her Flesh, one of the most shocking exploitation films of its time. Directed by Michael Findley, under the alias Julian Marsh, this film pushed boundaries so far that many theaters outright refused to screen it. The story follows a war veteran named Richard Jennings, whose life spirals into madness after discovering his wife's infidelity. In a moment of rage and heartbreak, Richard is injured in a freak accident, leaving him disfigured both physically and mentally. What follows is not a tale of redemption, but of pure revenge. Consumed by hate, Richard begins a violent crusade against women he deems immoral. The film blends elements of horror, sleaze, and psychological trauma, turning the viewer into a silent witness to his deranged descent. It's grim, disturbing, and shockingly personal, especially for an era still bound by strict censorship codes. The Touch of Her Flesh was banned in several countries, including parts of the UK, for its extreme sexual violence and sadistic overtones. Critics called it depraved and unfit for civilized audiences. But over time, it became infamous among cult film fans as one of the earliest examples of grindhouse revenge cinema. Interestingly, it was also part of a trilogy, followed by The Curse of Her Flesh and The Kiss of Her Flesh, each more extreme than the last. These low-budget New York shockers were shot guerrilla style in dingy apartments and cheap hotel rooms, giving them a raw, unsettling realism that no big studio could replicate. Today, The Touch of Her Flesh stands as a twisted time capsule of 1960s underground exploitation, a film that defied censorship, morality, and good taste, all in the name of shocking its audience. It's not easy to watch, but impossible to forget. 5. Olga's House of Shame, 1964. In 1964, the world was changing fast, but Olga's House of Shame took audiences somewhere they weren't ready to go. Directed by Joseph P. Mora, this shocking entry in the notorious Olga series blurred the line between underground art and outright exploitation. The film follows Olga, a cold, calculating woman running a secret operation involving coercion, manipulation, and control. Behind the polished glamour and shadowy warehouses lies a twisted power struggle, one that exposed society's darkest fantasies about dominance and corruption. Shot on a shoestring budget, Olga's House of Shame relied not on gore, but on suggestion. Its black and white cinematography gave every shadow a sinister weight. Yet its themes of captivity and psychological torment were far too raw for 1960s America. Critics called it moral poison, and censors across several U.S. states and parts of Europe swiftly banned it. Still, underground audiences couldn't look away. They whispered about Olga, the beautiful, terrifying woman who embodied forbidden power in a time when women were expected to be submissive. Ironically, that's what made Olga's House of Shame so unforgettable. Beneath the exploitation label, it was also a warning about control, cruelty, and what happens when empathy disappears behind authority. Today, it survives as a cult artifact, not for what it showed, but for what it dared to say in a decade that demanded silence. 6. Naked Evil, 1966. The Curse of the Obeah. In 1966, British audiences were confronted with something they had never seen before, a dark, unnerving exploration of black magic, voodoo rituals, and psychological terror, all wrapped inside a gritty post-war mystery. Naked Evil wasn't your typical horror flick. It began as a police investigation into a series of mysterious deaths among Jamaican immigrants living in England. But what started as a routine case soon descended into a nightmarish world of obeah, a powerful and forbidden Caribbean witchcraft tradition that terrified even the most skeptical viewers. The film dared to blend British realism with supernatural horror, revealing racial tensions and cultural fears of the time. It showed ritual markings, eerie chants, and psychological manipulation, scenes that British censors in the 1960s considered too disturbing and spiritually dangerous for public screening. Religious groups protested, calling it a mockery of faith and decency. Some theaters pulled it after only a few showings. The British Board of Film Censors demanded heavy cuts, removing ritual sequences, certain violent imagery, and even dialogue that referred to death magic. But even in its censored form, Naked Evil developed a haunting cult status. Fans admired its bold attempt to explore the clash between modern science and ancient beliefs, a theme decades ahead of its time. What made it so controversial wasn't just the horror, it was the idea that evil didn't come from monsters, but from human fear, ignorance, and obsession with power. Today, Naked Evil is remembered not as a simple exploitation film, but as a daring psychological experiment, one that revealed the uneasy underbelly of 1960s British society and paid the price for being too honest about it. 7. The Sadist, 1963. A shocking portrait of human evil. In 1963, when most Hollywood films still played it safe with polished heroes and clean-cut endings, a small independent movie called The Sadist came out of nowhere and terrified audiences beyond belief. Directed by James Landis, The Sadist was inspired by the real-life crime spree of Charles Starkweather, a young murderer whose story had already shocked America. But this film didn't glamorize his violence, it trapped viewers inside it. The movie follows three unsuspecting teachers whose car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, a blazing California desert. But their bad luck turns into a nightmare when they cross paths with a sadistic young man, played by Arch Hall Jr., and his unhinged girlfriend. What makes The Sadist so disturbing isn't the amount of blood, it's the realism. Every scream feels authentic. Every bullet hits like a punch. The tension never lets up, and the grainy black and white cinematography gives it a documentary-like rawness that felt too real for 1963 audiences. The film was banned or heavily censored in several countries for its psychological brutality, cruel dialogue, and unrelenting sense of dread. Critics called it a descent into madness, and some theaters even refused to screen it after early audiences fainted and walked out in disgust. Today, The Sadist is considered a hidden gem of the exploitation era, a film that dared to look into the eyes of evil long before mainstream cinema was ready to. It paved the way for future horror and slasher classics that would take inspiration from its raw, nerve-shredding intensity. The Sadist wasn't just another 1960s exploitation flick, it was a warning of how darkness could wear a human face. 8. Shanty Tramp, 1967. The film too scandalous for its time. In the heat-soaked South of the 1960s, Shanty Tramp dared to go where few films would even dream of treading. Directed by Joseph P. Mora, this low-budget shocker followed a small-town preacher's daughter, a seductive young woman trapped between her own desires and the cruel hypocrisy of the world around her. What made Shanty Tramp infamous wasn't just its sultry title, it was the way it pushed the boundaries of morality, race, and religion all at once. The story unflinchingly depicted themes of lust, manipulation, and revenge, wrapped in a gritty world where every action came with a devastating price. Audiences were stunned by scenes considered too explicit and provocative for the decade. Religious groups protested the film's depiction of the church, while censors condemned its racial tension and bold portrayal of female sexuality. In several U.S. states and across Europe, the movie was banned outright, labeled as moral filth and a danger to decency. Yet over the years, Shanty Tramp found a new life, rediscovered by cult film lovers who saw beyond the shock value. Beneath its exploitation surface lay a mirror reflecting America's darkest social contradictions. It became a time capsule of forbidden cinema, proof that even the cheapest drive-in flicks could challenge authority and expose the raw nerves of a changing society. Today, Shanty Tramp stands as one of the most daring exploitation films of the 1960s, a banned masterpiece of sleaze and social commentary that dared to ask, what happens when innocence and corruption collide in a world built on sin? 9. Satan's Bed, 1965. The Devil in New York City. In the mid-1960s, when America's moral guardians were already panicking about rock and roll and rebellion, a strange, gritty little film emerged from the dark corners of New York's underground cinema. That film was Satan's Bed, a shocking exploitation piece that blurred the line between art, horror, and urban depravity. This was no ordinary movie. It was a disturbing cocktail of psychological tension, criminal violence, and sexual obsession, shot on the streets of Manhattan with a rawness that made mainstream studios panic. Directed by Michael Findley, a filmmaker infamous for his grindhouse aesthetics, Satan's Bed followed a young woman trapped in a web of crime, manipulation, and sadistic control. But what really stunned audiences was its gritty realism. It looked too real, too uncomfortable, and too chaotic. It starred Yoko Ono, years before she became a household name as John Lennon's partner. In this film, she played a woman slowly descending into fear and madness, her performance so hauntingly authentic that many viewers were convinced parts of it weren't acting at all. The movie mixed exploitation-style violence with experimental film techniques, rapid cuts, distorted audio, and handheld camera work that made the viewer feel trapped inside the nightmare. Censors in multiple countries, including the UK and parts of Europe, immediately pulled it from distribution. They called it immoral, degrading, and corrupting to public decency. But among cult film fans, Satan's Bed became something else, a forbidden artifact. It represented the 1960s underground film scene's rebellion against Hollywood's polish and censorship. It dared to show human darkness without apology. Over time, the film gained a second life on grindhouse circuits and bootleg VHS tapes, whispered about as a banned masterpiece that dared to go where mainstream cinema refused to tread. Today, Satan's Bed stands as a grim time capsule, a reminder of how far filmmakers were willing to push boundaries before the modern rating systems existed. It may be hard to watch, but it remains a fascinating snapshot of an era when art and exploitation collided in the most unsettling way possible. From Yoko Ono's eerie debut to the censorship chaos that followed, Satan's Bed remains one of the strangest and most haunting exploitation films of the 1960s. 10. Scorpio Rising, 1963. In the early 1960s, America was still clinging to its innocence, but one underground filmmaker decided to rip that illusion apart, frame by frame. The film that shocked the censors. Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising, 1963, wasn't your typical exploitation film. It was a raw, rebellious, and hypnotic collision of sex, violence, religion, and rock and roll. Set against a pounding soundtrack of 1950s pop hits, the film followed a leather-clad biker preparing for a night out. But what starts as a simple ritual of dressing up in chrome and chains slowly transforms into a shocking commentary on fascism, rebellion, and erotic obsession. Every shot was soaked in symbolism, Nazi imagery, Catholic icons, homoerotic undertones, and scenes of desecration that left audiences stunned. When Scorpio Rising was first screened in 1964, it didn't just offend, it exploded the boundaries of what cinema could show. Police raided screenings, and the film was banned in several states, including New York and California, under obscenity laws. Critics called it blasphemous and psychologically disturbing. But the underground loved it. Artists, musicians, and even future directors like Martin Scorsese and David Lynch would later cite it as an inspiration for its bold, dreamlike editing and fearless imagery. Despite being banned and censored, Scorpio Rising became a cult masterpiece, a film that dared to link pop culture with death worship and desire, showing how icons of rebellion can become objects of control. Kenneth Anger wasn't just making a movie, he was building a mirror, reflecting a generation obsessed with power, sex, and self-destruction. Today, it's remembered not as porn or propaganda, but as art on fire, a fearless statement that changed the language of underground cinema forever. Scorpio Rising may have been banned, but its influence spread like wildfire through every corner of modern culture, from music videos to avant-garde cinema. Would you dare to watch it today? Let us know in the comments, is this artistic expression or exploitation gone too far? And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button to explore more of cinema's most shocking banned classics, only on Globewise Entertainment. 11. Mondo Topless, 1966. The shocking documentary that redefined 1960s censorship. In the mid-1960s, when Hollywood was still clinging to its moral codes, one underground filmmaker decided to throw subtlety right out the window. His name was Russ Meyer, the self-proclaimed king of skin cinema. And in 1966, he unleashed a film so scandalous that it was banned in multiple countries and nearly blacklisted in the United States. That film was Mondo Topless. At first glance, Mondo Topless pretended to be a documentary about the lives of go-go dancers in San Francisco, women chasing fame and fortune in the city's neon-lit clubs. But beneath that thin layer of sociology, Meyer delivered a film drenched in sensationalism, camera angles that pushed the limits of censorship, and a jazz-fueled rhythm that made audiences squirm. There was no real plot, just endless montages of dancers, voiceovers of women sharing their dreams, and fast-cut visuals that blurred the line between art and provocation. Critics called it a documentary without a conscience. But what truly set Mondo Topless apart was its timing. Released right as the world was rebelling against conservative norms, it became a lightning rod for controversy. Censors in France, Italy, and Australia pulled it from theaters almost instantly, calling it obscene masquerading as art. Even in the US, local boards from Boston to Chicago demanded edits, and in some cities, screenings were raided by police. Yet, strangely enough, Meyer claimed he was making a cultural study of modern womanhood. exploring how society objectified women even as it celebrated their freedom. To some film historians today, Mondo Topless stands as a bizarre time capsule, both a critique of exploitation and an exploitation film itself. Despite the backlash, Mondo Topless made money, a lot of it. Drive-ins and midnight cinemas played it to packed houses. And while mainstream critics dismissed it as trash, underground audiences hailed it as rebellious and raw. Today, it's remembered not for its shock value alone, but for how it pushed the boundaries of what could be shown on screen, forcing Hollywood to confront its own double standards. Mondo Topless remains a vivid symbol of 1960s exploitation cinema, controversial, unapologetic, and forever stamped with the label, banned, but unforgettable. 12. The House on Bear Mountain, 1962. The Forbidden Comedy of Flesh. In 1962, when America was still clinging to its conservative post-war ideals, the House on Bear Mountain dared to strip them bare, literally. Marketed as a horror comedy but remembered as one of the earliest, nudie-cutie exploitation films, this bizarre mix of monsters, humor, and scandal pushed the boundaries of what could ever be shown on screen at the time. The story takes place at a mysterious finishing school tucked away in the hills, where Professor Barry Mahone, who was also the director, supposedly runs a respectable institution for young women. But behind closed doors, this mountain mansion isn't filled with books and lessons. It's crawling with vampires, werewolves, and an endless parade of topless students. The tone swings wildly between campy jokes and body voyeurism, showing more skin than scares. But what really shocked audiences wasn't just the nudity, it was the fact that it mixed it with horror themes, long considered sacred ground by censors. It was like Dracula meets a burlesque show, and for early 1960s America, that was absolute blasphemy. Local theaters that dared to screen it faced immediate backlash. In some states, morality boards banned it outright, labeling it a public indecency masquerading as art. Religious groups protested, and even drive-in theaters faced police raids for showing it after dark. Yet, the controversy only fueled its underground success. Bootleg copies were traded quietly among curious college students and film buffs who couldn't believe such a film even existed. Over time, The House on Bear Mountain became a cult legend, a perfect example of how far filmmakers would go to challenge Hollywood's strict moral codes. While critics dismissed it as cheap smut, it opened the door for future exploitation filmmakers to blend genres and rebel against censorship. Today, the movie stands as a time capsule of the early 60s rebellion, part horror spoof, part nudist comedy, and all-out cinematic chaos. It might make you laugh more than it scares you, but it undeniably marked the beginning of a bolder, brasher era in American cinema. The House on Bear Mountain wasn't just a film, it was a middle finger to censorship itself. Imagine a movie so absurd, so risque, and yet so self-aware that it made the moral guardians of the 1960s lose their minds. This is the film that stripped Hollywood of its innocence, quite literally. And there you have it, 12 shocking exploitation films from the 1960s that went too far for their time and paid the ultimate price, being banned around the world. These movies may have been condemned, censored, or buried, but they also changed cinema forever, proving that filmmakers were willing to risk everything to push artistic freedom to its limits. So, which one of these banned classics surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts and movie memories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of film history, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to Globewise Entertainment for more untold Hollywood stories, forbidden films, and cinematic secrets you won't find anywhere else. Until next time, this is Globewise Entertainment, where the past of cinema is never forgotten, it's just waiting to be rediscovered.